more people might wander in. So, um, did I share the right screen? Let me try that again.
Um,
I
I don't
didn't share
have
the
it.
screen.
I don't have it yet. Yep.
Okay. Um, I'm going to share the screen, and now you should see the slides, right?
I do. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how this is used, but we'll also be trying it. So what I'd like you to do is first join iClicker Cloud as a student. Now, if you don't have an account, go to iClicker.com, use your SUNY Oswego email address, create your instructor account. It's free for instructor's account. And when you create a student account connected to that using the same email address, that's also free. So there's no cost to the institution of the instructor's use of iClicker. So
Okay. So
it'll
iClicker.com.
iClicker.com and then
And
say join. So create an account and then choose an instructor account.
okay.
I think that's how it works. It's been a
Create
while
an
since I created
create an
one.
instructor account. Yep, I have it here. Uh, search for our institution. SUNY College at Oswego. Yep. Primary role instructor. Okay, they have different questions for me.
You only have to do that once.
Okay. I'm going to use this. All right. Remote ID. What-
Oh, that would only be the remote ID is only if you're using a physical clicker. Most people don't
Okay.
do that anymore.
All right.
So
Create
you can
account.
still use a physical clicker, but you don't have to.
Okay. It says, welcome to iClicker. Let's go. All right. Looks like I'm in.
Okay, but now exit from there and then go back in and log in as a student.
Okay. Let's see. It's the sign out. Sign out. Okay.
Well, you don't need to sign up now. Just do a login. It should be an option of,
A sign in, you mean?
yeah, do a sign in, but choose, it'll ask you if you're an instructor or a student. This time choose a student role so you can see what it would be like from the student side.
Hmm, I don't. Says you don't have any active courses.
Okay.
I don't see how to sign in as a student.
Oh, when you do a sign in, if you go back to iClicker, um, at the top, if you log out from iClicker, on the top right, it will say create an account and then it will say sign in. And in both of those is a drop down, which will be either instructor or student. So once you create the instructor account, you log out,
Okay.
then you go to sign in and choose student. And then
Uh,
you would log in with the same user ID and the same password that you just created.
hmm. Mind if I share my screen and you can
Sure. Yeah. Let me
maybe
stop
see me
sharing mine.
if I'm doing something
Sure.
wrong? Okay. Let's see. All right. I will share. Um, okay. So now I'm in.
Oh, that's still the instructor thing. So go back to just go back to the iClicker.com website.
Okay. Oh, I see the instructor.com.
Yeah.
That's where I was going.
Yeah,
iClicker.com.
it had you locked into that mode.
Okay.
And now sign in.
And now I
Not
should
yeah.
see the student
And
option.
then go
Okay,
to
I got you
student.
now. Okay.
And now you should be able to log in with the same user ID and password.
Okay.
And it saved it. So yeah. So now you can sign in as a student.
Okay.
And now you're not using a remote, so you can skip this step.
I don't have
And
any
now you don't
courses.
have any courses because this isn't set up as a usual course. But if you could go to this web address, join.iclicker.com/Waco, capital WAKO.
Join iClicker.com Waco.
Yep. Now, if you had a WAKO, and I think they're all caps, I think capitalization may matter.
Hmm.
Maybe.
Does it look like
Well, no,
is
I
this
think
what
the
you were looking for?
capitalization
Okay.
may matter. Yeah. So capital WAKO.
Oh,
KO, that was that may have been the issue.
yeah.
And now it should take you to here. Okay. And
iClicker course.
now, join the iClicker course. It's not sure why it's asking you to sign in again, but try signing in as a student and let's see. And just
Okay.
click sign in again. I'm not sure why it asked you to do that.
Yep.
There we go. Okay, so now you're in the cell group. Now, students, by the way, won't have to do all this because it is integrated with Brightspace, but the cell group isn't quite the same as a course. And we don't have a grade
Right.
book in the same way there. So with a student, what would happen is when they log in as a student, they'd be asked for their institution. If they type in Oswego, they'd see SUNY Oswego, they click on that. Then they could search for their courses using the instructor's name or the course name. And then they just join it, and then they're part of the course. And everything is done within Brightspace. So
Right.
all the grades show up there and so on. Okay, so now we're going to just try it just to see. Well, actually, here, I asked, we won't even necessarily look at your responses, but I'm going to start a poll here. And the way in which you share questions in iClicker, you just put them on whatever you're presenting, and it will give a screen grab of that and dump it to the mobile device screens, and then people will just respond. Now, this is a free response, so I am going to go up here. I'm going to start the poll, and then I'm going to go here to a short answer and then pick start. And that's going to give you a countdown. I said it for a minute and a half. You can type nonsense in there, but that's what it would look like for well, actually, oh, you know what? I should be sharing my screen now so people can
Oh
see it
yeah,
from
let me
the
get
other
out of
side.
here. Yep.
So
Sorry.
let me try that. So this is
Um,
what it looks like. This is what
so
the students would see. They'd see the information there, and basically the last line is the question. And so you have the open box where you can type something in. You can just type a few random letters. You don't have to
so you
actually
need
type a response to this.
I don't see your screen share anymore, John.
Um, it does say I'm sharing.
Huh. Oh, my problem. Yep, that I was sorry.
Okay. It's probably underneath what you were looking at.
Yeah.
And see,
Okay.
now it shows the
What are your
countdown,
concerns about the fall
fall
semester? Right.
semester. Yeah, and just type anything randomly. It doesn't
Uh,
have to be an actual
being
answer.
ready for the first day.
Okay. And see, now it will show once you, there we go. Now we have one response, so we can stop it because there's only one person. But you can see the number of people who responded. And now, if you wanted to display it, you could take a look there. And there we go. And there it is. And that is correct. You can mark it, if you have correct answers, you just click on it and it will automatically score whatever you set aside for a correct answer. Um, and so that's one type of question. And we're going to go through each of the types just so you can see what it can do. So in terms of polling, well, I don't think, well, actually, let's jump to this question because that was another free response one. So let's hear. This is select all that may apply. So this is a multiple answer. So you could have as many as you want. I'm going to start the polling, and now you'll see A through E, and just click on all the responses which you think are correct.
Multiple select questions, real time, maybe use two. Okay. Like that. Oh, okay. I think I'm going
And
to do
students, by the way,
all of
can
the above, I
respond.
think.
Well, then just click each of them.
I did. Yep.
Okay, yeah, and there it is, and it shows that. And in fact, what happens, we'll stop the polling, we can look at the results, and in fact, each of them is correct.
Oh,
And I put that in partly just to emphasize, what the research shows about this. It addresses students' metacognition because they get to see immediately whether they're right or wrong on something. So they're answering a question, they think they're correct, but now they're getting some immediate feedback on whether they really understood it or if they missed something or if they might misunderstand something. And it brings them back to task too. It also is giving us real-time information on what students know, and then we can do more just-in-time teaching because, if we teach based on what we think students know, some students are going to be some of the time students might already understand things. Maybe all the student understands something, and then it's a waste of time to spend
right.
too much time on that. On the other hand, if only a few students are understanding it, then we can focus our time on those things that students have find more challenging. So it lets us fine tune what we're talking about based on how well students are learning. But it's also letting students know, and I mentioned this briefly, that it also brings student attention back to focus. That if you are doing lectures, it's really easy for students to zone out. But if they
Yeah.
suddenly have to answer a question about what you've been talking about, or if they have to apply it, it brings them right back to focus. They stop watching their little games or playing games
Right.
on their phones. They stop shopping. They're all of a
Yeah.
sudden focused back on what we're hoping they are focused on. And if we allow them to have a stage where they get to discuss it with other people, which is the best way to do this type of thing, especially if the questions are more challenging, it gets really loud while they're discussing these things. And then we typically have them vote again, and then we go over it. And we can call on students, ask them for why they think this is the best answer, and so forth. And then we can reveal the answer once we get to that stage. But it also can be used at the start of a discussion, to check for any preconceptions that students have or what prior knowledge students have. We could also use it just to check in to see how our students are doing, how they're dealing with the day-to-day stresses, to get a feeling for the mood of the class, and any number of other things. We can also use it for those 1-minute quizzes or the stop, start, continue types of things, etc. Just to get a feel for how the class is going, to get some feedback from all the students. And we don't have to have the material graded. We could just do a survey type thing. We could even make it anonymous if we chose. And to do that, if you start the polling, one of the options here, oops, I didn't mean to do that right then, so ignore that question. One of the options here is before you start the question, you could set it to be anonymous. Um, and by default, I have it set as a countdown. You could also have students rate their confidence if you want to get a little bit more metacognitive stuff going, because there, students are not just making a choice, but they're also ranking their confidence and rating their confidence. And, if students see that they were really confident, but they were wrong, or if they see that they were not very confident, but they were correct, that might cause them to adjust their metacognition a little bit and come up with a better understanding of what they know and what they don't know. We could also select screens if we had multiple screens, but we'll just stick with this screen for now. Okay, now
Excellent.
here's something, a question, and we haven't discussed this here. But it was discussed in another workshop. In fact, it might have even been that. Oops, let's go back. It might have even been that workshop where we use those. I don't remember at this point, but this is now not a multiple answer. It's going to be a multiple choice. So we'll choose that.
Okay.
Most often, it's multiple choice and free response are the types of questions used.
Average learning gains.
And the experiments that were done were pre-test and post-test on material. And so they had classes where clickers were used in this type of polling technique, classes where it was more straight lectures without the interactive use of clickers. And they measured the difference between the pre-discussion and the post-discussion scores. So it was a measure of how much better students understood things after they had a class that focused on the topics. And let's see how you did. Let's take a look at that. We'll stop the polling again. And and you
I,
picked
s- I
20 to
said
50%.
20 to 50%. I thought it would increase it quite a bit, but we'll see what the answer is.
Well, it turns out that Carl Wyman, in an experiment with chemistry with several other faculty, found a doubling of scores, that
Oh,
they students ended up learning twice as much, or their scores improved twice as much in the class where there was clickers than the class without it. And Eric Mazur, in his physics class, found that there was a tripling of the knowledge
oh
gains.
wow.
So it was really a pretty dramatic effect in both cases. And the only difference was the use of clickers to check on student understanding and that peer discussion component as well. And if you look at Claude Wyman's paper in particular, it shows the breakdown in scores over the course of the study, and the whole distribution for the classes where clickers were used is shifted way to the right. So the bottom tail of performance just overlaps slightly with the top tail of the class where clickers were not used. Now, other studies have found changes that are not as large. The learning impacts seem to be very large in STEM fields, but pretty much there's only one or two studies that found no significant increase in learning. However, even in those classes, they found that students' engagement, students' enjoyment of the class was higher when clickers were used. So even if students did not seem to learn more in just a couple of studies, they still found the use of clickers helpful and more enjoyable. And,
Yeah.
making learning more fun is not a bad thing either.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's probably at the high end of the impact, but most studies have found in most disciplines there has been an increase in student learning. And here's a numeric question. So it's
Okay.
asking for a number. And here we'll start the polling. Um, so there's 100 flu cases, then cases rise by 10% per week. 2 weeks later, how many new cases would there be? So there's 100 now, and let's say it
Right.
sticks around for a couple of weeks. So 1 week later, they'd
Look,
have 110, and
110,
then
sure.
so then it would be 10% more than 110, um, which would be
So,
1.1 times that,
right.
which I think is 1.21. So just
121. Okay.
yep. But you don't have to put that. You could put any answer in there.
I'm looking at it says use. Oh, I see what it's trying to constrain the response to
To numeric. Mhm.
you're right. Got it.
And so we'll stop the polling. And now what would happen if you had a class is you'd see all the possible numbers here. And you could just click on it to select the correct one. If you do this with a class of, 250, 300 students, it's going to be a long list of numeric values, but it will group them. So if there is 100 people who picked 121, you click it and they all get credit for it. And the other ones would be wrong.
Got
So
it.
that's how you might use a numeric question. Let's see. This one's kind of interesting. This is a target. And here we don't need to go over the question. It's a fairly specific thing. I did use
Yep.
this question actually in my intro class, but it turns out the share of attacks that's paid by consumers turns out to be area A right there. And so when we start the polling, you'd see the map on your laptop or on your mobile device on your smartphone, and you would either touch it if it's a smartphone or move the cursor there and click on it. And it would show you all the points that students had selected.
Oh,
So
all right.
I guess you
I'm
might be
gonna
able to do this with a
let's
music score, or you might have some sort of a frequency distribution or something
right.
where
Right.
where students could pick out an area. So just click on any area
I
and we'll
would be
see.
guessing, John.
Well, it's area A, by the way.
Okay.
So
I'll do the wrong answer. Okay.
okay. So we'll stop the polling. And now what would happen when you see the results is you get this sort of thing. And you can see here there's only one response, but if you click on it, what you can do is define a rectangle. Well, in this case, oops, I messed up. I was automatically going to pick the wrong answer. But the rectangle would actually be area A. And let me see if I can shift that. I guess still can. I forgot. And then can I drag it down? Well, in any case, yeah. So what you can do is you can adjust it. It's always going to be a rectangle though. So if you use this for something, it should probably be something where a rectangular grid would capture all the right responses. And then it would mark it correct if the answers were in there. And then you would save that and that would automatically mark it correct for anyone there. This could be useful in a geography class where people had to pick something out on a map. It could be useful in art history class or an art class where people are analyzing shadow or perspective or other things, or different types of styles where there could be any sort of image on the screen. And then as long as it can be represented within a rectangle, it should work. I don't use this very much. I only did actually this one question just because I wanted to try it to see how it worked. Um, so you can use it with physical clickers, but if you do, it's only multiple choice. Or with a mobile app, it's any of those types of questions. The problem with doing physical clickers is students have to buy the clickers, and the mobile version supports all these types of things, the ones we've just gone through. Software is cloud-based. Before, when we used the old version of iClicker, it was all done with a USB drive that you had to bring to class and plug into the device or into the computer and use it. And that led to all sorts of problems. The most
Mhm.
common one was faculty using it the first few times would sometimes leave the USB drive in the computer and then they'd have to run back and try to get it before someone else took it or whatever, because all the grades were stored right on that USB drive. The other thing that would happen back then with the older version of iClicker was that sometimes faculty would take the drive out before they closed the application or before they disconnected it, and it would corrupt the drive. And then you'd have to go back and fix the drive, close all the unclosed files, and then retrieve the data and then move it over. And I used to do that for a number of faculty who had some sort of problems with it. But now it's all in the cloud and it just works smoothly. And all the grades can automatically be added to the Brightspace gradebook if you want to grade things.
Yep.
These were the old physical clickers. I've got some in the room here. They were, well, back then when they were last being sold, they were 20 for used, 45 new. Um, and they also required a radio frequency connection to a base station, which means you couldn't use them any larger distance away. An advantage and a disadvantage of iClicker is that students can use it remotely so that if they are in the class, they can always join, even if they're not physically there. So they could be in their dorms, they could be in another country or another state and still participating in the quizzes, which sometimes is appropriate. Back when we were in COVID, this was really helpful because I had some students who went home to other countries
Yeah.
during the shutdown. And I had some students who were in another state during the shutdown. And when we were working over Zoom, they could still participate no matter where they were. I did have a couple students who had already purchased a physical clicker or had one from an earlier class and they were hoping to use it, but they're only good within a couple of hundred, well, maybe 120 or 200 meters or so of the base station. So if they were on Long Island or Pennsylvania or in Trinidad, they were not going to be able to use that to connect to, the web because there was a point to point local connection. So I don't know of
Have
anyone in
you
our, go ahead.
one of the things well, like I was talking about before we started here with the recording, for the concert attendance class that I'm going to be running in the fall, I did look a little bit on iClicker and it said there's something called geolocation.
Yes. And that is
Have
one of
you
the
used
settings.
that? And how, if you
Yes and
have,
no.
how that would be what we would need. Okay, we're doing a whatever concert in the Hewitt Ballroom now. so people can't kind of log in as if they're
Yes
at the
and
concert
no.
when they're not, you know?
In theory, that should work well. And again, I think it's on the very next slide. So
Oh, okay,
it's
okay.
still free for students to use these, but let's go to that next slide. You do need a base station, but that's not an issue. Most students must use this, but there's geofencing. And what happens with that is when you set it, it has to be tied to a specific location. And it's tied to students recognizing that location. And when I have done this in a large class, it's worked fairly well for people with classes of 40 or 50, generally, often with no problems at all. In a large class, though, it's going to have some issues. Some students will have GPS turned off. So you have to assist them at least the first time in turning GPS on. The
Mm.
other thing is, it's possible to spoof your locations with GPS, especially with Android apps. There's lots of Android apps available that will allow you to spoof, and there are some iOS ones as well that will allow you to spoof your physical location. So students could still be somewhere else, but they could choose on a map a point right in your classroom or right where your classroom should be, and they should end up appearing as if they are physically present. Most
Yeah,
students
okay.
won't know how to do that, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
information out there on the web of showing how to do that. So basically, you just get a geo spoofing app, and you run that, and it will appear that your phone is in the room, even if you're not physically doing it. One of
Okay.
the one of the things that led to a really widespread use of this a few years back was Pokemon Go. Because what happened with Pokemon Go is a lot of people didn't want to go out and actually walk or drive to locations
Right.
where certain things were occurring, or there are regional exclusives in Pokemon Go in other countries. And so what people would do is they would spoof their location to make it appear that they were in Europe or China or South
Okay.
America so that they could still participate. And those apps work that way for anything that's GPS based. So as
Okay.
far as your phone knows, it appears that you're wherever the location has been set by the app that overrides the actual location. So that's one problem with using the geofencing. The other problem with it is that some students will not be able to get the correct location because they may be connected through AT&T or Verizon rather than using the campus server. And with the campus server, generally it works. So if people are connected to Wi-Fi in the classroom, that's usually sufficient because it will use the Wi-Fi hotspots to help determine the location of the student in terms of the
Uh,
GPS. But if they're connected through AT&T or Verizon, it's going to be not necessarily tied to where the student's phone actually is. It's going to be tied to wherever the nearest um,
right.
location of the GPS signal that is being shared by AT&T or Verizon. If they're not able to pick up GPS, and in many of our buildings, GPS doesn't work very well because of the concrete and steel that
Right.
essentially limits access to GPS. So,
That
so
would, yeah, that would be an issue for, Tyler 50 is a room where we do a lot of our student performances, and that one is kind of on the, we'll say the lower level or the basement level of Tyler, and it doesn't get good cell, coverage down there.
well,
But
actually, if it's not getting cell coverage, but students have turned on
it,
their Wi-Fi
they could
calling,
do
it's going.
Wi-Fi, yeah, it'd be no
So
problem.
it will typically work well for people who are on Wi-Fi as long as they don't do um, geo spoofing.
Okay.
So it may work. But yeah, it's worth it. It's worth looking
I'll
into.
poke around and see if I can I also like the fact that I could, log in as a student and actually try it and see, I get a little nervous about, deploy and again, there's a lot of students in this. There's probably 100 students that would need to be able to do this. So I get a little, if I get everything lined up and I think it's working and then, it's a big disaster the first time they use it. That's the kind of thing I want to try it first on my own to see what they see. Uh,
Now, when I have done this with my large class, there's usually with like out of 250 to 300 students typically recently since COVID, our numbers are lower now. It used to be 400. When I've tried geofencing, there's usually 2 to 5 students who have a problem. Either 2 to 5 students who are not able to connect to the service because it the server thinks that they are outside of that area. Normally going in there, opening the GPS or opening the map location and having them search for their current location will often make it work. So that because sometimes what will happen is some phones won't regularly connect to GPS unless it's called. Opening the map and choosing your location will tend to put them closer to where they are,
mm,
at least, and then it usually worked. In other cases, there was 1 or 2 students who we just couldn't get it to work reliably. But that doesn't tell me much about the students who were not actually there but were spoofing. And it's probably not many, but there's a good chance some might do that.
mm,
And once 1 or 2 does, it tends to spread. But it's
yeah.
worth a try. And for most students, it did work. I ended up never doing it for more than 3 or 4 classes. And in fact, one of the times when I did it was because after the midterm, attendance dropped quite a bit. And there was
Mm,
one day where there was probably 20% of the class missing. So I said, okay, next class, we're going to use geolocation, and you'll only be able to participate if you're in the class. Attendance went up a little bit that day, but because the people who weren't there didn't always watch the videos or hear that we're going to start doing this. And then it did make it more clear that there were a lot of students who were participating from some other location, maybe from their dorm, maybe from the cafe, maybe from a bar, maybe from another city or state. But it did get them back into the class. However, what was happening is in a class at large, there was always 1 to 3 students who were legitimately sick. And I had each time there was someone who was hospitalized but still
mm,
wanted to participate in the class, or there was someone
right.
who was traveling for a sports team, but they still wanted to participate in the polls because they could watch the class over Zoom and they could still vote if geofencing was turned off. So I generally went back to turning it off just
Mm,
because I wanted students to be able to participate remotely. And, when someone was going to be in the hospital for a week and a half recovering from some surgery and they want to participate, I didn't want to rule that out. And there was no easy way to get them in participating in these things without disabling the geofencing. But
right.
having done that and kind of threatened them that we can always go back to this if they disappear again, attendance went back up to where it was. And usually in that class, it was like 85 to 90%. And partly that's because of the use of polling each class day. It does tend to make sure that people do show up.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so there's that. A couple other points. Let's see. And we talked about this a little bit early. The best practice, and this is something that Eric Mazur came up with back 22, 23 years ago, maybe 24 now. You open a poll, ask everyone to respond individually with no discussion. Check the responses, typically on another screen to see how they're doing, or it could be on another device. It could be on a phone or an iPad to see what the breakdown of responses is. And if you get between 30 and 85% of the class with correct responses, ask the students to discuss their response with others, preferably those who had different answers, argue, give them a few minutes to debate that, and then let them vote again. And it almost always increases. And then you share the results. You ask students, why they chose certain responses, and then you give them some feedback and you let them, develop an understanding. But one of the, did you by any chance attend Eric Mazur's talk here 13, 14 years ago?
I feel like I might have, yeah.
One of the things he did was remarkably effective. He demonstrated a different clicker system because he was actually involved in creating another platform. Um, but he had a picture on the screen of a metal plate with a hole in the middle. And he said, what happens to the size of this hole if you heat this plate up in an oven? Um, and the answers were it will get larger, it will get smaller, or it will not change. And people voted. And then he said, okay, now discuss it with other people around you. And this, we had a couple hundred faculty attending that. And the volume got really loud and people got really energized in that discussion because they had very strong opinions on what would happen. And then he said, now, did you notice how loud it got here? Did you notice how everyone was actively engaged? If this was a class and I was lecturing on what happens to the hole in a plate of metal when it's heated up, it would be about the most boring lecture you could imagine in a physics class.
Yeah,
But look at how actively you were all engaged. And then he went on to another slide with a different topic. And the faculty there got angry, annoyed. They wanted to know what the answer was, and they wouldn't let him go on and actually move on to the next topic until he explained it. And that was done deliberately. He does a lot of these talks.
yeah,
And it was designed basically to show, look, this provoked your curiosity. You wanted to know what the answer is. And that's why this works so well in the classroom. You can take questions that people might not really care that much about, but once they've argued it, they've debated it, they've taken this position, they want to know if they're correct or not. And that can be really an effective way of provoking more motivation and intrinsic interest in learning because, again, people commit to something and they want to know if they're correct.
right.
Tying into our curiosity. Okay, so and Tyler, do you have any questions? You came in the middle of this, but any questions? Or Daniel, Dan.
No, good on my end. Just wanted to get a quick refresher of things, so appreciate it as always.
So, any other questions, Dan?
No, I think I'll just get going with it. I might reach out to you if I run into any problems. I'm sure you could answer, oh, just do this kind of thing. But I did, like I said, I poked around on their website. It did seem like it had pretty good support docs, and um, I think I should be able to get it rolling.
I've never had any major problems with it. The worst cases is maybe twice in the last 14, 15 years, however long it is we've been using iClicker, when the server went down. And that's only happened twice that I remember, and it was only for a few hours. The other issues that we used to have a lot was Wi-Fi in some classrooms did not work that well. And in
Mm,
Lanigan, when you had 400, I had up to 420 students in the room, there were often students who couldn't connect to the Wi-Fi. But they've upgraded the Wi-Fi so
yeah.
much since then that that has not been an issue in at least 5 or 6 years. So,
Okay. Yeah, it
and,
looks like a really powerful tool to use, and I'm gonna give it a shot, John. I'm looking
and
forward to it.
everyone who's used it has done it, have continued to use it pretty much.
Yeah,
There was
yeah.
only one person who gave up on it. It was someone in psychology, and it was someone who was concerned about the possibility that students might need extended time. And you can't give extended time to just one student without giving it to everybody. Um,
Mm,
I've never run into that issue, mostly because you usually set enough time so that it works for everybody, and you can see the number that's coming in. And if someone says they needed more time, you can always adjust the timing and leave it a bit higher. I
yeah,
usually default to about a minute and a half when I first set up the class, and then drop it down to a minute and a quarter, or perhaps to a minute if it's a smaller class and people join more quickly. So the only issue is that sometimes when students are doing this, they may exit from the poll, go off and do something else on their phones, and then they have to reconnect to Wi-Fi if the connection dropped. And that sometimes causes a delay. But but usually a minute and a quarter is more than enough after the first day of class, basically.
Okay.
So,
All right. Think I'm good.
okay, any questions? Let me know. I'm happy to try to help. I
All
enjoy
right.
working with this stuff.
Thank you, John, as always.
Oh, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.